Hello, so today we're actually going to be ranking components in TFT. We're going to talk about which components are a little bit more high value, some of the items that they build into, as well as just rank them from S to D tier to kind of give you like a little bit of an idea and a little bit of a more for fun, shorter tier list, kind of discussing some aspects of the game in set 15. If you like my content, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm doing a little bit more for fun content right now, making some tier lists because it's towards the end of set 15, but normally I'm doing daily TFT guides. If there's a guide or anything that you would like me to go over, or any topic, please make sure to mention it in the comments below because I am looking for ideas. Tomorrow we're going to do some more augment guides, so some stuff talking specific about augments in the game and specific comps that might play around it, something like the frying pan, specific augment, things like that. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about components. So when we're thinking about components, a lot of times they turn into different items that we're going to use on our carries or our tanks in the game. But certain components you'll often hear as being more high value than others, and a lot of it comes down to what items they can kind of build into and how valuable those items are in the most typical situations in a game. So here it's like a little bit of like a light version of the items rankings, but I did do a lot of item rankings already, so if you want to check those out, just check out the tier list on items ranking on my main channel. But anyways, sword. Sword I actually put in A tier. I think it's a pretty good component to play around. So sword is usually like the AD dedicated item, because obviously most of the items that build into sword give you some form of AD or AD scaling, which is basically like attack damage. So orange stat. The thing about sword that's really great is that it has options for both AD units. It has some options for AP, because a lot of AP units actually like Shojin, which is a casting item. A lot of units love Giant Slayer. Giant Slayer is really good in the current set as a generic kind of like catch-all type of item. So there's ways to kill it. There's ways to deal with it. Even Edge of Night on certain carries can be really good. So you have options to play around the sword for both frontline and AP units, and additionally Steric's a decent frontline item if you have nothing else to make. So for sword, obviously if you're playing AD, it's what you want, but even if you're not playing AD, sword can make sense in a lot of situations to make some offensive components, and it could also be used to make a couple of frontline items as well, so I consider it to be around A tier. Bow usually is considered to be one of the other high value components. Bow turns itself into a variety of different AP and AD items. Bow generates attack speed, and attack speed is generally pretty good on most units in the game. Attack speed helps auto attackers auto attack, so those are more AD focused units, and bow items will also help in some cases AP units cast, because like obviously if you scale with attack speed in any way, you're going to generate mana more easily, which will allow you to cast as well. If we look at some of the bow items, it can be used to make a lot of different utility items, so you can make shred, sunder, or anti-heal with bow, so it's very valuable if you're looking to make utility. But then also it makes one of the best AD items in the game for auto attackers, which is the Kraken. It makes Giant Slayer, which like we said before is a really good generic damage item, but then it also makes Gwinsu, which is the other primary attack speed item. Additionally, it also creates mana generation for AP units, so it's a way of getting mana gen if you don't have a tier in the form of going a crit build with Nashers. So it's extremely flexible, and you often can't go wrong, because no matter what type of comp you're playing, either AD, AP, or more auto attack focused, or if you're just looking for utility, a bow will be able to find its way on a team. Even if you have too many bows, one thing that we'll mention a lot with items is if you have too many of them, what do you do with it? Having too many bows is actually not, it sometimes is an issue, but it's not a major issue, because 2 bows makes anti-heal, red buff, which is actually a utility item that's good on any board. So if you have too many bows, you can actually just convert that into a utility, which is pretty beneficial for your team. If you want to talk a little bit more about items and item slams as well as that stuff, my item guides go into this in more detail. Like I said, tier lists are more for fun and just like general, like, you know, I don't want to say clickbait, but more like for fun information in a more for fun format. But my item guides go into a lot of depth of actually talking about like making items, killing components, dealing with extra components, things like that. But either way, these two, they kind of find themselves in A tier. I would say that tier, however, I would put in S tier. I think tier is one of the best components in the game. Now, this doesn't mean that you should always be taking tier no matter what. Obviously, too many tiers can be bad. Tier is the form of mana generation. There are AD units that love mana generation, but a lot of times AP units are the ones that like mana generation the most. But additionally, it can be used for frontline items. Tier is really essential on a lot of different units, right? If you think about caster units, Shojin or blue buff is going to be an essential item. Of course, it can also make AP style items for utility, things like Void Staff, and additionally there's different forms of, like, you know, we'll talk about like melee items as we progress along further, but Hand of Justice is one of the better melee omnivamp survivability kind of items in the current set, so you also have that option with Hand of Justice. The other thing that makes it really good is that you have things like Protector's Vow. Protector's Vow usually allows a lot of survivability for your front line, but it's also one of the main ways to get cast off for units that love to get that cast. For example, like a Jarvan, Protector's Vow is really essential on that unit. So Protector's Vow in general, just having a starting mana effect, or an effect where on combat start you're gaining a huge influx of mana, that's like a unique ability that is extremely potent, extremely powerful on a variety of units. So if we look at Tier can make some of the best frontline items in the game, it can make some of the most essential caster items in the game, and it can make, like, in some ways, like utility or survivability for different units that can work really well on a lot of different boards. As a result, I feel like with Tier, you can't really go wrong. Obviously, if you're playing more like an AD auto attacker build, then Tier might be a little bit awkward, but just the fact that it can make really good frontline items is that help the frontline units to cast, and in turn like cast really powerful effects or survive. It kind of has like this really important role that a lot of times you're usually not sad to have a Tier, is what I would say. Anyways, next we have Rod. Rod actually put a little bit of a step down between bow and sword. Bow is so great because of its flexibility, and a lot of times you're going to see bow being a component on carousel that's very easily taken. And then sword a lot of times makes sense in more AD builds, but it can also have like a little bit of a frontline or utility aspect, you know, like something like a gunblade in that regard. Rod is a little bit more awkward to play around if you're not playing around AP in particular, right? Rod basically makes AP items, it gives AP, so it makes sense. You have things like Jewel Gauntlet, Spark, Morello. These are AP focused or more AP style versions of utility items. And then you also have like things like Rabadons, Archangels, right? We didn't talk about Archangels with the Tier, but for the most part, you are making really solid AP items. Now, why do I put in B tier and not in the same tier as sword? I think it's just because of the sword's flexibility to have a little bit of extra frontline as well as a little bit of extra survivability. When I think about sword, there's a couple outs for swords that you can use no matter what comp you're playing, right? Like an Edge of Night could find its way on a backline. It's generally considered to be pretty good on a lot of different units, and it can also work towards a frontline item. A Bloodthirster and Asterix, but mostly Asterix, could work as a really good frontline item. Bloodthirster as well, in a pinch, gives a health shield, can also work kind of like a frontline item. The real only out besides AP related items for a Rod, like obviously Gwynsu if you're playing auto attacker build, but the only other one is Crown Guard as like the only other frontline item, because a Spark is not really a frontline item, it's more of a utility item. It doesn't give a lot of like tankiness. Crown Guard itself isn't even that great on some units because it mostly just scales AP. It gives you like a huge health shield, and then it gives you a bunch of AP. So you have to specifically be a frontline AP unit a lot of the time, as opposed to Asterix that I think just gives like way more shielding in a lot of cases. So it's kind of like, I feel like Crown Guard in general is like a worse version of Asterix, because Asterix gives like more HP, so it has like a little bit more of like a defensive nature to it, even though it gives AD and this one gives AP. It's just like a little bit more awkward. So that's the thing. I feel like with Rod, unless you're playing like an AP related comp, it sometimes feels a little bit awkward to have too many Rods. Obviously, if you're playing around AP, it's really good, but that's why I put it more in the B tier. That's not to say that it's bad. The way that I look at it is like, you know, B tier is like the average case. So like, you know, in some spots it's going to be really good, and in some spots it's going to be really bad. And then A and S, these are going to be like, they're more likely good. That's like the way that I make the tier list on my channel usually. Next we have Chainmail. Chainmail I put in B tier. So Chainmail, similar to Rod, it's a little bit situational. Chainmail, the main thing about it is that all it does is make like really decent tank items. There's some other options, right? You can make a Titans, which we didn't talk about with Bow, but Titans is a little bit awkward of an item. It basically just gives you ramping up stats, and then it gives you CC immunity and a little bit of damage amp. It's a little bit awkward in set 15. It's kind of getting reworked a little bit. I'm assuming there's going to make some changes into the next set, just because it kind of feels a little bit awkward in its current place. Before, Titans used to be like this 1v9 monster item that you would put on a frontline unit. They'd ramp it up and they'd get a bunch of armor, and it would make them like really hard to kill, as well as give them a bunch of stats. Now it kind of feels like it doesn't give you those tank stats, it just gives you like damage stats, so it just feels like a weaker version of some other damage items because you need to wait for the ramp up effect. But it's kind of like awkward. It works maybe in some spots. I think like maybe like, you know, I've experimented with it on certain units, like a Lee Sin, for example, that has the survivability with like a Juggernaut frontline. Titans is a little bit better because then you can make use of the stats really well. Edge of Night is like a survivability item, so it's not really like a frontline item, but everything else is a frontline item. Now, the only thing with Chainmail is that it's mostly armor related. You can find ways of making it more MR related or other things like that. But it does make into a lot of great items, right? Bramble Vest is really good early game no matter what you're playing. Obviously, Protector's Vow, we talked about it before. It's really strong. It also makes utility in the form of the Sunfire, which, you know, if you really want to get anti-heal, it's another way of getting anti-heal. Steadfast is a way of getting durability, so it works pretty nicely in that regard as well. The only reason I don't consider it to be much better is that if you having too many chainmails could also pose a little bit of a problem in certain cases. The main problem with chainmails is that it's mostly a defensive component, so you can't really use it to ever make like backline items. Now that sounds really obvious, but you'll see with some other items there is a level of flexibility in that regard. But it's mostly just dedicated to making like tank style items, and then it also scales a lot more with armor because it is an armor related item, so it could also be lobby dependent. For example, like a Bramble Vest, I said it was good early game, but it can be really useless late game if a lot of your lobby is playing around AP. Similarly, a lot of the other items that give stats, in a large part, most of these items give armor. Some of them give extra other stats, but it's like a little bit awkward. And the same thing with like Edge of Night and Titans. They're a little bit situational sometimes. So those and Crown Guard we talked about before, right? Like there's a couple of these. Even while we're at it, we might as well throw in what's it called? Sunfire as being a little bit situational as well. So it's just a little bit of an awkward sell in certain spots. Next we have Cloak. Oh, we might also rearrange these tiers a little bit because I want to kind of separate them out. I have S to D tier here. Cloak is probably the worst component in the game. I think most people agree with this, and it's not like a huge surprise. Cloak is just really specific, and it's like a more specific version of something like the Bramble Vest or the Rod. It's just like the items that Cloak makes are all really awkward and very situational, so a lot of times you can run into problems of having too many cloaks. Cloak is never really an item you want too many of because the item's options are like like I said, a little bit awkward, right? If we go over it, right, it's mostly like a tank component. It's supposed to give magic resist. But if we look at the items that it builds Bloodthirster, which is more of like a melee style Omnivamp giving tool, which is specific, right? A lot of times Bloodthirster is outshined by Hodge because Hodge builds more into damage builds. Bloodthirster works on certain units and can be really great on certain units, but of course it's just like more of a situational build a lot of the times. Kraken is usually just an auto attacker AD item. That's probably one of the best items you can make with Cloak, so we don't have to talk bad about it. Kraken obviously really good. You're often making Kraken. Spark, situational. It's an AP item. It's a tank item, but it's not really that great of a tank item. They buffed it a little bit, but it's still not like up to par. A lot of times you'd rather have Void Staff. Adaptive Helm, we didn't talk about it already, but Adaptive Helm also a little bit situational, just in the way that it generates mana. You might want to use another tool to generate mana. You know, Gargoyle is fine, but usually that's like more for like solo frontlining type of beat because it gets more armor in that regard. Declaw is kind of feels a little bit awkward and underpowered because obviously it's not the same like Bramble where it's good early game. It's mostly just a check for like AP in your lobby, but if there's not a lot of AP, it's awkward. Then we have another utility item in the form of the Even Shroud, which often isn't that great. And then we have QSS, which is almost like another utility item because it's mostly for like CC immunity and gives attack speed. Now, obviously that can work really well on auto attackers, but as you can see, it's like a tank component where it makes a lot of either utility items, some of the backline items, which a lot of them are like kind of like hit or miss, but that's the main thing. A lot of the items here are hit or miss. If you have too many cloaks, right, and you slam a Declaw, it's a little bit awkward, right? If you're slamming like, you know, these extra items in a lot of regards, like maybe sword we might move it down a little bit because too many swords can pose a problem, but like, you know, too many bows, not too much of an issue. Too many rods, a little bit of a problem. Too many tears, and not usually an issue. Too many like if you could make a Bramble, it's not even that bad because Bramble's good in a lot of situations, but making Declaws, that's an item where it might be like completely useless. Even though it has like a healing effect to it, it's not that strong of a healing effect that it warrants like having too many cloaks. So a lot of times, like if you're going on carousel and stuff, unless you're like really pressed to make like a particular build, like a double Kraken build for an Ashe or anything like that, Cloak is usually one of the components that is avoided. It's one of the ones that you don't really want too much of. Now that's a little bit of a set 15ism as well, because there are certain comps in the past that use cloaks really well. For example, if you have a unit that likes Bloodthirster QSS, so you're making like a melee carry where they don't have built-in CC immunity, so you go CC immunity with the QSS, and then you go Bloodthirster, and you make them like kind of into a monster. That was something that was really common in previous builds of previous units, is that there's not really a Bloodthirster QSS unit, right? You can imagine that would have been Volibear, but Volibear gets Omnivamp and stun immunity from his own ult, so he doesn't need it, right? That's why you don't build Bloodthirster QSS on Volibear, because he has it built in. So, you know, that's what I mean. If there was a unit that like Volibear, that instead his ult just did more damage and didn't give him CC immunity and Omnivamp, then Cloak might be a little bit more popular. But that's like the main argument that I'm making here, or not argument, but the main thing I'm trying to explain. Next we have Belt. Belt actually put in A tier. Belt is like the utility item. You could basically make anything with the belt, which is really nice. So you have frontline items in the form of the belt, right? You can make Anima, Warmogs, and then Sunfire, which is kind of like a frontline item. You can make utility in the form of like the Morello and the Sunfire and the Even Shroud. So a lot of times when you're taking a belt, it's good for utility. But then there's also like really good items like Sterix. I think in general is just a solid item. It's a really great frontline item. It just gives a lot of HP and a really big HP shield. So I find that it works really well. Even if you're not putting on like a Giga melee style AD carry, it's a good use of components to just make a frontline item, which is a big heavy lifting for the item, for the component itself. But then additionally, you also have stuff like Nashers. That's a great AP caster item. You also have Strikers. Strikers is a great way of turning that into a really solid damage amp backline item that pairs really well with crit. Strikers is like an essential part of a lot of builds in the current set and in most sets in general. The thing with belts is that it's super flexible, right? If you have too many belts, you can just slam Warmogs, right? Having extra Warmogs on units, there's like prismatic augments that are just dedicated to you getting a bunch of Warmogs, right? It's not bad. It's definitely not bad at all. So it's definitely up there. I like it a lot because of its flexibility, so I generally consider a belt to be in that A tier. And next we also have what's it called? We have Glove. So Glove, this is what I mean. I'm probably gonna move stuff down, by the way. So like of this tier, I think Sword is maybe a little bit worse because too many swords could be an issue, right? If you're playing AP and you have like 3 or 4 swords, it might be a little bit more awkward than having some of these items. Glove, I think, is also super flexible. It's similar to Belt in that you can make a lot of different items with it. It's a little bit more awkward than Belt, but you can make crit with it. So crit is a great way to scale no matter what your build is. So a lot of times, you know, building towards an IE Jewel Gauntlet, if you're playing AP or AD, is great. And then you can also pair that with a Strikers and just have a full crit build where you get crit and damage amp, which is really nice. You have stuff for auto attackers like QSS. You have stuff for melee like Hodge. You have a little, like, Last Whisper is a little bit more utility focused, but also I think Steadfast is good enough to consider as a solid frontline item slam if you have too many gloves as well. And then the last thing that's really great about Glove is the Tempo Slam in the form of TG, where you just get 2 items for the price of 1. Now the items are random, but it is a great thing for tempo early game, and it's great for itemizing 5 cost late game where you just want to slam a bunch of items on everybody, but you don't have as many items to do so. So in general, I think TG is solid in terms of like just having the flexibility and options. But I think now I'm going to space them out a little bit more. I think of these, I might do something like this. Or I think bow is really important though. I think bow, especially in set 15, I think a lot of units love bow. Because even the units that don't really need the bow for attack speed, they still like things like Nashers. But I think like Katarina. Right, Katarina, you don't really care too much about bow. But Nashers is like really good on her. Right, Akali is really good on her. I feel like every single unit in the game could use a bow in one of their builds. Sword might be a little bit more awkward. Maybe we'll do something like this. I think like this is fine. I think Rod, I don't like Rod as much as Sword, but I want to make it very clear the divisions between these tiers are not very large. When I'm doing this tier list, that's like, you know, a lot of it is in the context of the game that you're playing, right? Obviously, a Cloak can be the best item in the game. If you need to make a Kraken and the Cloak is on Carousel, you're definitely going to take it, right? If you need to make a Rabadons and there's a Rod on Carousel, you're definitely going to take it, right? It really depends on what you're playing and what you're angling towards, but I'm just trying to use it as a more general aspect. Like if I start my game on 2-1, which items am I happiest to see, right? If I start my game on 2-1 and I have a Cloak and a Rod, I'm kind of a little bit sad. If I start my game off on 2-1 and I have a tier and a glove, I'm a lot happier. I feel like I have a lot more opportunity to play around the game, because depending on what my later item slams are, I can use that cloak either for frontline or backline. I can use that glove for frontline or backline. That's what I'm trying to say, right? Like when I look at my game from game start, there's certain components I would rather have because I have more options around them. Finally, we're just going to rank the other two things. I think that these components, like obviously, I think that Spatula is a little bit better than Frying Pan, but they're around the same. Usually, maybe it's a little bit worse. I think Frying Pan's a little bit worse. Like, the main thing is that Frying Pan gives you bonus effects, and it makes you able to make all of the classes. So that's your Edgelord, your Duelist, your Sorks, your Prodigies, your Bastions, your Juggernauts, your Heavyweights, and all of these have, like, little special bonus effects. The thing that makes Spat a little bit better is that specifically Spat, like obviously they play into certain traits. If you need it for a trait, it makes sense, but the Strategist emblem is probably one of the best items single-handedly in the game. And no, I say item, not just emblem, because not only does it give you the Strategist synergy, which is a team-wide buff and gives a lot of benefit, it also gives you either extra armor on adjacent units, or it gives you extra attack speed on adjacent units. So that's like a support item-esque effect, where not only are you activating a synergy with it if you get Strategist emblem, you're also buffing units that are nearby, which is a much better effect than pretty much anything that any of the other items offer. So for that reason alone, I think Spat is a little bit above, and I would actually put in A tier. If I see a carousel and I see a Spat, if I can actually take the Spat, I would gladly take it and make a Strategist emblem no matter what comp I'm playing, just because I think Strategist emblem is so powerful. I think that's where I would leave the components as is. This kind of reflects a little bit of how I play the game, where I'm usually looking at components in a way of being flexible options to build towards different items. So I think it kind of reflects my playstyle. A lot of times these are the components that I'm taking more often than others. But of course, always make your items make sense. Always take components that make sense with your items. This is just more of a for fun tier list. I'm trying to find more unique things to try and make tier lists on, try and experiment a little bit as the set ends with some more for fun content. But of course, if you're looking more into items and you're trying to figure out items in general, please check out my item guide. It's a little 4-part series, and it talks a lot about some of the things I talked about in this video, but in much more detail, kind of going through everything with examples. They were made a little bit ago, so you know they're not going to be as relevant to like the current meta, but they will still go over all of the aspects that will make you really comfortable playing around different components in your game. But anyways, thanks for watching, have a great day, and see ya. Bye bye.